Nice to work with this organizing committee. Very, very well organized, great communication. They did give me a challenging topic, and I hope that you'll find my message to be of interest to all of you tonight. In the way of a public service announcement, I also want to mention that if you haven't admired the design of these doors in the bathroom here, you should see them, because I think if you're in there, you're safe. No one else is coming in. Someone should pat it. It's very impressive. So, sharing the prairie. The challenging theme. My approach to it tonight is to consider it as a work in progress. I'm going to ask Ross to help me with the slides. So, we're going to start off with the 5 S's. The 5 S's of sharing. First of all, consider the definition. To sharing is to have a portion of something with another or others. To give a portion of something to another or others. Use, occupy, or enjoy jointly with another or others. Next slide. The second is sharing, of course, is very much supported by human values. And here's an example of some, a list that someone has kind of put together, and I cherry-picked from there the ones that I think are perhaps the most relevant to sharing: respect, equality, justice, responsibility, respect for nature, Constitution, and rule of law. The third S, next slide, is stewardship. And environmental stewardship refers to responsible use and protection of the natural environment through conservation and sustainable practices. And our old friend Aldo Leopold championed environmental stewardship based on the Land Act, dealing with man's relation to land and to the animals and plants which grow upon it. And the fourth S is sustainability, meeting present needs of today's population without compromising the needs of future generations. And the fifth is, I'm going to spend a little more time on this, is this whole, we're going to talk about the commons in a minute. And I looked up this, played a little bit with this term of the commons, and I discovered this term, common pool resources. So just bear with me while I share a little definition here. Common pool resources are natural or human-made resources where one person's use subtracts from another's use, where it is often necessary but often difficult and costly to exclude other users outside the group. And the kinds of things that we're referring to here include fisheries, forests, grazing lands, wildlife, water resources, irrigation systems, and so on. So I think prairie probably fits in here quite nicely. Next slide. Now, successful sharing of the common pool, we need to pay attention to some disciplines. We need information. It's suggested scientific knowledge, but I think we need that tacit knowledge that comes from people on the land. We need a system to resolve conflicts. We need a regime that fosters responsible users and who know how to respect limits. And we need it to encourage adaptation. So I've worked with the grazing lease system in Alberta. It has some flaws with it, but I think in my experience, probably a lot of those disciplines I think are present in our system. So let's talk about the tragedy of the commons a little bit. And this term was coined by a fellow named Eric Carden, and he published a book or a paper in Science back in 1968. And next slide. The tragedy of the commons is it's a metaphor for anything held in common, used by all freely and not regulated. Everyone will maximize his own benefit to the detriment of the whole. Water commons include the sea from overfishing, air, land, and water if we're polluting it, public noise levels if we're making excessive noise. It might happen on grazing lands or national parks or the earth itself. Next slide. And here's a nifty little diagram that kind of captures this. So if we look over on the left side there, everybody can hear me okay? Right to the back? Okay, so thank you. Over there on the left, the use of the commons below the carrying capacity of the land, and all users benefit in that condition. If we move over to the middle slide, if one or more users increase the use of the commons beyond its carrying capacity, the commons become degraded. The cost of the degradation is incurred by all users. And then if we move over to the far right, unless environmental costs are accounted for and addressed in the land use practices, eventually the land will be unable to support the activity. So I think we can all kind of relate to this as something that was definitely part of North American history, but perhaps comes to bear in certain places today as well. So I'm going to go through a few examples of the tragedy of the commons, and perhaps how there's been some recovery from that. And of course, we're thinking of our human values, stewardship, sustainability, and our tests of common pool resources. So next slide, and next slide. In the American West, our history of settlement, we're very aware that as the settlers moved west, the water became scarce, farming often shifted to grazing, ranchers needed more grazing land, so often federal lands became grazing commons. Sometimes this period was called free range or open range period. And this resulted in the establishment of the Taylor Grazing Act, and it actually resulted in the development of policies and organizations that tried to tackle this problem to manage and restore the Western rangeland. So today we have organizations like the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management. If we move closer to home, one more. If we move closer to home here in Canada, the Dominion of Canada grazing lease policy of the day, which of course started in 1881, magnified the pressures that were experienced both of climate and settlement on our prairie grasslands. In those early days, grazing lease policy was yet to be science-based or to address the inherent differences in productivity of the land. So grazing lease taxation and rental rates were not based on reasonable economic returns, ranching, and therefore there were compelling economic pressures to overgraze. The inequities of the system were felt most strongly in the semi-arid southeast. I'm talking from the Alberta experience, but I'm guessing that this would have been felt across into southern Saskatchewan as well. And those, of course, are mixed grass, dry mixed grass ranges where the productivity might be a fifth or less than in the more well-watered portions of the, say, the foothills or the parkland. Next slide. Now, one of my heroes that we know very little about is a guy named George Ross. And George was instrumental in organizing local ranchers in southeastern Alberta, and they farmed in the early days the Shortgrass Stock Growers Association. I think that organization eventually merged with the Western Stock Growers. And so they began to raise questions to their elected officials about the state of the range. Now, given the problems of drought and economic viability, the ranching community played an important role in the development of rangeland research. It was this community that formulated the first research questions. They wanted to know, how much can the land sustain? And in one of their meetings, I haven't got the exact date of the meeting here, sometime in the 1920s, it was reported that the committee defined carrying capacity as the number of cattle which will be grazed in good commercial condition upon the range and preserve the grass with a reasonable carryover from year to year. So the next really important development was the development of the experimental farms. Experimental farms were in existence, but the establishment of one for it. And this station was established. This is another quote from a history book by Hargrave. The station was established at the request of the stockmen in 1927 by the Dominion Department of Agriculture in cooperation with the Gilchrist brothers of Wild Horse. So I think you folks have been dealing with all of the transition that's come with the PFRA pastures. And my work life has been altered this year by being responsible for the taking back both 1-4 and stately back to the government of Alberta. And so we're working on a model to actually keep range research happening on both of these sites. But in going back through the files, going back through the history of 1-4 in particular, it's fascinating to see that the Gilchrist brothers ponied up portions of their Dominion grazing leases, 17,000 acres in the first go, and probably another 20,000 acres in the second go. And they essentially ponied up the land and the questions for the first scientists to come and to begin to study this thing, this carrying capacity. So I really see 1-4 as being kind of the birthplace of range science in Canada. Next slide. So this kind of, I'm just going to take you through this. This kind of, the red line is kind of the government recommended stocking rate. Starting from 1881, the bison were gone by 1879. Dominion of Canada grazing leases were established by 1881. And the government of Canada got a number of things right. Your allotment had to be fenced and it had to be utilized within a minimum time period. But they imposed a compulsory stocking rate of 10 acres per head. So even in the best watered portions of the foothills, say the foothills in our part of the world, where using the old-fashioned way of describing stocking rate, say 24 acres per head, they didn't have a chance of making it. So it's not surprising that the first sort of committee, the first lobby group, was actually established by about 8 years later, and because of this inequality. So then we had, Alberta became a province, we had the heavy load of horses for prairie plows on the landscape, we had grassland being withdrawn for cropping, and there was just a pile of pressure on the range. And it all, this is a period where the stockmen were asking the questions, looking for the science support, policy support, and then finally the whole thing came to a head, of course, when we entered the Dust Bowl. So I won't want to tell you the whole timeline, but you can see the red line through time shows both the experience and the development of science that went on to kind of get us to where we are today. This graphic here I produced for our sage-grouse best practices guide. So if anybody wants to read this history, it's on our, just look up Alberta beneficial practices for sage-grouse and you can find it there. So George wasn't done yet. He had more to, in an attempt to address the issues concerned ranchers formed the Stock Growers Association. And here's the resolution from their 1938 annual meeting. Whereas the cost of grass to leaseholders is charged by the provincial government in rent and taxes heretofore has not been based on the productive values of various range areas, therefore be it resolved that with a view to rating grazing land according to its earning capacity in relation to livestock values based upon investigations and surveys already conducted in shortgrass. So they got the research going, they took the learnings from the research, and then they got the provincial government. Now the provincial government is controlling the land base after 1930, and, next slide, by 1945, the province implements our new grazing lease policy, and it utilizes these concepts. And many of these concepts are still embedded in our current grazing lease policy. Next slide. Okay, so I'm giving you a bit of history tonight. This is kind of the travel log part of the presentation. I'm going to tell you about the sharing of ideas from Saskatchewan that took place down to South America to accomplish conservation. In 1987, I went to a savory raising school with Lynn and Sherry and a bunch of other ranchers. And I also met a fellow there by the name of Dr. Norm Simmons. Norm was a wildlife biologist with the Canadian Wildlife Service, and he and his wife were very interested in conservation work in southern Alberta. And when we were at this meeting, I remember one evening sitting at supper, and Norm Simmons was talking to one of your old-time range conservationists from Saskatchewan here, a guy by the name of Robert Lodge, Bob Lodge. I see anybody who knew Bob? I believe he worked for PFRA. Anyway, Bob, I knew about Bob from my school days because he was one of the characters who helped to define this idea of complementary grazing, that we can create tame pasture or use spring adapted forages and combine those with our native grassland, and that'll allow us to provide spring rest and spring deferral. So anyway, I just happened to be a fly on the wall, and I listened to that conversation between Dr. Simmons and Bob Lodge. Well, fast forward about 10 years ago, 11 years ago, I took Ross and my wife and our other son Malcolm, four of us went to spend 40 days. We gave up Canada for Lent. We went down and spent time in Peru. And we had a wonderful opportunity to see the sharing of ideas and seeing it being translated onto the ground. So, the story of the tragedy of the commons as it unfolded in Peru and parts of South America. The Spanish conquest came in the early 1500s. And then over hundreds of years, a variety of different things happened. Initially there was a hacienda period, large ranch holdings. Late 1800s there was a period of industrial development where rangelands, grasslands were severely degraded by livestock used in all manners of industrial activity. From there, in the 1900s, of course, there was Marxist land reform that took place, and then more recently, some lands have been privatized, or some of the old communes have continued to kind of operate on their own, much like I would say, like a Hutterite colony would do. Next slide. So anyway, as you travel through Peru, you will see through the we're in a region called the Sierra Blanca, the white Andes, and we would see the headwaters, massive areas that would have this history of very, very heavy overgrazing. Next slide. And so just to orient you here a little bit, Lima, capital down here, and then up here, it's a place called Huascarán. There it is, Huascarán, up here in the Sierra Blanca. This is the base for the Mountain Institute. Next slide. And the Mountain Institute is an organization that works to conserve high-priority mountain ecosystems. They increase the environmentally and culturally sustainable livelihoods of mountain communities, promote and support mountain issues. Now, Norm and Hyla Simmons have actually invested their own personal dollars in actually establishing a couple of country schools up in this environment. And the goal is to raise up mountain kids so that they can work their way up into the system and try to have an influence on things. Next slide. So just an example of the kind of uncontrolled sort of tragedy of the commons that even continues to exist to this day. Next slide. Highly erodible environment. Stream systems carrying their massive maximum sediment bed load. A mining engineer that I met said that looking at the Andes when it's raining, portions of the Andes looks like ice cream melting. So that kind of gives you a sense of just how sensitive some of this landscape is. Next slide. Here's the little village of Canray Chico, and this has been part of Norm Simmons' work over the last, I think, about 20 years or plus. And Luis Espinoa is the Peruvian conservationist here, range conservationist, working with this community to rehabilitate their area. Next slide. The grasslands, there's sort of two major components to the grassland that I got to see. This degraded, glaciated upland. You have to go through probably a week of acclimatization to even feel normal at this altitude. We're at about 13,000 feet, 13 to 14,000 feet for those that don't like meters there, which includes me. Normally the grassland is dominated by these big, growthy bunch grasses that even our rough fescue that we have in the foothills and mountains, it would be 3 or 4 times the size of one of those plants. What you have in place is this species they call Stipa ichu. Even Even a waiter in Lima knows about stipe pichu. Sorry, next slide. It's this wolfy plant that's kind of the last thing that remains at the bottom end of range health. Highly degraded glacial valleys. Next slide. And so these, they have an area of opportunity, and it's the valley bottoms, of course, very much like our part of the world. Thick organic horizons, and we have these remnant plant communities of I don't know I could never get a common name, of course, but it's a type of fescue, Fescue cadulicophylla. Next slide. And so here's some remnant patches. And this, on the day that I'm visiting this commune, they're actually going through a restoration effort. They're actually in the process of developing a second complementary pasture that they're going to use for spring grazing of their dairy animals to delay grazing of the upper portions of the drainage. Next slide. So here's the little village of Canary Chico. And next slide. Here's the local mayor and the administrator of the commune with their families. Next slide. So here's the work day. Everybody's involved. First thing they're going to do is they're going to fence off this paddock. This paddock will be developed into a highly productive, kind of manicured and managed, high producing tame, not a tame pasture, but a kind of a modified native pasture that will be fertilized with dairy manure and irrigated, and this will provide spring grazing. And so they're laying out a grid about roughly a meter square. Next slide. With these tools are kind of remodeled drive shafts, and they go along, and as they work their way across the grid, they punch out holes about 2 inches in diameter and about 3 inches deep. Next slide. And then they harvest this fescue plant. Next slide. They split up the plants and they create plugs. And these plugs will then be planted and will be the foundation of the new pasture. Next slide. They have a kind of a local technology that's been manufactured locally for water spreading. You see the valves are just pop bottle caps. They can remove the bottle caps wherever they need water to flow. Next slide. Here's the bottle caps. Next slide. So I don't have a picture of the lush pasture, but here's the pasture. It's ready to go, and Lucho is very pleased. So here's our Canadian colleague, Wormson, that's taking some Saskatchewan ideas down and translating them down to Peru. Sharing the Prairie. Next slide. And again. I thought I would just mention these folks, and I must admit I really haven't studied them much over the years, but I think everybody probably recognizes that term, the Buffalo Commons. Deborah and Frank Popper from Rutgers University. Their proposal originated back in 1987 in an essay, and they contended that the current use of the drier parts of the plains is not sustainable. And they viewed the historic European-American settlement of the plains as hampered by a lack of understanding of the ecology and an example of the tragedy of the commons. Many people in potentially affected states resisted the concept during the 1990s. And so the way they would describe it is, once again, as a metaphor, as a representation of something else. For example, in North Dakota, the North Dakotans could see it as an area to specialize in buffalo production. In the rural Pacific Northwest, it could be they could focus on salmon. Next slide. In land use terms, this I think has been kind of rolled over, and certainly in academic circles, students are probably familiar with this. An umbrella phrase for the long-term restoration project to counter the long-term effects of 3 cycles. And this included the Homesteading Act of 1862, another round of homesteading in the 1900s, and then between the period of 1940 and 1970, the period where major alteration of plains took place, with aided and abetted by certain agricultural policies. Next slide. The reaction was variously interpreted, the metaphor as kind of as an assault on their way of life. many Great Plains people intensely dislike the commons portion of the metaphor. Sometimes the only point the group could agree on was that they didn't like the Buffalo Commons. So anyway, next slide. I thought this might have been interesting to be excluded in Dr. Popper's class. Anyways. Next slide. So I guess I'd just like to pay tribute to our Prairie Conservation Forum in Alberta, Prairie Conservation Action Plan here in Saskatchewan. And I think these are both organizations that touch most of our 5 S's that we started out with there. And I guess I know the Alberta Forum best, but I have a hunch that there's a mirror image between these organizations in Alberta and Saskatchewan. The Forum itself is not a not-for-profit organization whose members represent a voluntary coalition of around 50 organizations. These organizations include, and we heard that list, it's the same list that we heard in the introduction. These members are dedicated to advancing the goals outlined in the action plan, and wherever possible, attend regular PCAP meetings to share information, collaborate on projects, participate on working committees, and contribute resources to advance the aims of the forum. So I'm going to come back to this at the very end of my talk, and just share a little bit more about the forum. Next slide. So, I guess the key part of my message tonight is to kind of share with you the struggles that we are going through in Alberta. And once again, I expect that these are going to be similar in your prairie world. What are the imperatives for us to share the prairie? I think the first thing we need to do, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, is to acknowledge the stewards of the land and what they've achieved. And when we rationally consider what has been accomplished, this is beyond the capacity of any government organization to deliver the same kinds of outcomes. I think this is just a simple fact. Next slide. The way if I try to explain what our ranchers do to my latest deputy minister or assistant deputy minister, you notice in my first opening slide there, I didn't even have my department name right because it keeps changing. I'm not current. The way I will explain it to an executive member is, okay, there's more forested land in the province. Here's many more millions of forested acres. The way we manage that, the way we try to get our environmental outcomes on that 24 forest management agreement areas is through a rule book. The land that you see portrayed here are all the grazing leases in the province, scattered through the province. And so the livelihood and the benefits that those ranchers achieve, and then the values and benefits that are achieved for our society, the stewardship outcomes, as we call them, they depend on the actions of 7,600 disposition holders. And so the approach we take is very different. We don't begin with a rule book like we do in the forestry world. We have to work in a more cooperative and collaborative way. Next slide. Not only do we need to acknowledge and appreciate, we need to address the financial realities of modern ranching and the other things that may be affecting their future success. And I see a lot of change taking place that troubles me right now. I don't see the normal rolling over and succession taking place. Very often we're seeing grazing leases changing hands to people who may not have any history. And there hasn't been that sort of generational knowledge transfer taking place. Next slide. I think this is the critical moment to implement a framework that can measure and reward the contribution of our prairie stewards to ecological services. And I hope while I'm here this weekend I'll hear more. I know this has been a hot topic in Saskatchewan, and I'd like to hear more about the thinking that's going on here. Policies, some of the policies that we can include in our world include things like extended tenure and market-based tools to try to provide those stewardship incentives. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up here by talking, I've got about another 20 slides. I'm going to talk about managing cumulative effects. Next slide. Okay, so Ross, I'm going to just let you start working your way through this animated slide here. I don't know, any of you in the room here have heard of Dr. Brad Stelfox? A few of you. Dr. Stelfox has done a great deal to raise our awareness and understanding of cumulative effects in the context of land use practices. Brad's approach is not one of finger pointing, but rather to make us collectively aware of the slow and progressive impacts that we have had on our land base, impacts that we may simply be unconscious of. So we need to understand and manage the multiple overlapping impacts that we have on our agricultural lands and native landscapes like native prairie. So while Ross is transforming the landscape there with cumulative effects. So that brings us to a major initiative that's been ongoing in Alberta and consumes a lot of time with myself and my staff, and that's the land use framework. And this is, in my career, this has been the most serious effort to try to manage development pressures that I've seen in my 38 years of public service. And so this is the cumulative effects management is the key focus. It's recognizing that there's a finite carrying capacity on the land. We've known that for years with things like range management. We have to adopt this same kind of thinking with other types of land use practices. And so that's our goal, is marching through the province, 7 land use regions, and to implement cumulative effects management plans in each one of those regions. Now, the one I'm going to just talk about a little bit is the South Saskatchewan. Go ahead. And that's South Saskatchewan Regional Plan. First of all, I'm just going to take you through and look at how the landscape has changed. That's a representation of what's left of our native prairie environment there. That's from the Grassland Vegetation Inventory, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute too. Next slide. This graphic shows so first thing I have to say, I'm going to show you some results of modeling. Modeling does not predict the future. It doesn't predict where we're going to get to. But what it does do is that it alerts us to trends, changes, and it helps us understand where we may be heading. It gives us an opportunity to perhaps change our destination. So one of the basic realities, and this is now understood all the way up to the Assistant Deputy Minister who's in charge of this planning initiative. They understand that there's only 33% of the grasslands left in the South Saskatchewan. We've converted 67% of those. Now, we enjoy many benefits from, obviously, much of that conversion is to agricultural production. And these are deliberate choices that we've made, and our society benefits from that. But we need to recognize that we're starting to diminish that supply. Next slide. One of our assumptions, I think, that's got us in trouble as well, is that this notion that, and this is Brad's model again, just using data from Alberta Energy. This is quite dated now. It doesn't include some of the new stuff that's coming out, like fracking. But back in the late 90s, early 2000s, this was kind of our idea of how the energy footprint was going to come onto the landscape and go off. So that's a 50-year projection looking for, that's 100 years of history with kind of a 50-year, if we're kind of at this point here, that's looking at another 50 years. So the assumption was that just as we reclaim these well sites, that it returns to being prairie. Now, some of the work that we've been doing, and Jane Lancaster is here, colleague Jane Lancaster with the Foothills Restoration Forum, and so the work that we've been doing in the industrial sphere has helped us understand that assumption may not be correct. Next. Next slide. Even with effective reclamation and restoration practices, development may result in fragmentation of the native grassland landscape. Impacts include lost acreage, more anthropogenic edge, those straight lines cutting up the prairie, loss of integrity, that means invasive species moving in, shadow effect, invasives moving off the right of way, reduced habitat effectiveness in invasive species and weeds. Next slide. So we can actually take our inventory information and we can start to look at it. We can break our landscape out into, call them canisters, little buckets of knowledge and information. We're just showing 4 of the common ones here: fields, fescue, mixed grass, silver sagebrush, and prairie riparian. Next slide. So probably one of the most useful little diagnostic tools, just like, you know, the doctor checking your pulse, taking your blood pressure. Probably one of our most useful tools to get an initial read on how our landscape is doing is to look at edge density. Just jump ahead to the next slide, Ross. This shows you, it's a forested landscape, but you can get the picture. This shows different levels of edge density, 1.5 kilometers per square kilometer, all the way up to 6. Okay. So jump down to the last slide. So if we look at our landscape buckets or canisters today, we can see that many of them are starting to edge into this yellow zone here. And if we just kind of carry on with business as usual, in 50 years, our landscape will be starting to look like that landscape does in Europe, where it's basically cut up. So that's the challenge for us, is to start to measure and monitor and look at our practices to try to see how we can manage these changes. Next slide. Next slide. So one of the obvious concerns about this increase in this cutting up of the landscape is that every time we create another corridor, another trail, another road, another power line, another pipeline, we can, in many areas, we can be quite effective in reclaiming that, getting back to something like what we had. But if we don't get it right, and if we bring in our invasive species, here's a roadway going through Suffield Weapons Range. And there's been no seeding here. This is just the result of traffic. Lots and lots of vehicles moving through here. Over time, you can see that the crested wheatgrass has occupied the corridor. And now it's moving off-site. It's moving with the wind. That's called shadow effect. Okay, so when we say losing, loss of integrity, that's what it's like. Here's the next slide is an example from Dave Noggle down in Montana, who's working with sage grouse, just showing that as we intensify, if we go from something that's relatively lightfoot, like ranching, and we combine that with agriculture, intensive agriculture, and full bed methane, you can see the effect that it's having on the habitat that's left for sage grouse. So I want you all to repeat after me. Next slide. Ik, mig, me. All together now. Ik, mig, me. Okay. You heard it here tonight. What does ik, mig, me mean? It means, next slide, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Okay? This is an old concept to range managers. Whether they formally measure their range condition or just look at their pastures, they maintain their stocking records, they maintain their precipitation records, they put this information together and they use it to achieve their sustainable operations. Well, that's the world that we have to move into in the prairie. We have to learn to measure and manage what's left if we want to have something for the future. Next slide. One of our new tools is the Grassland Vegetation Inventory. We're 100 townships. We've got 100 townships left to go. Right up here. So that's satellite data that's been patched in there. The rest of it is a detailed, photo-interpreted image or a map base. Interprets 32 different types and gives us a lot of information about biodiversity. Gives us a really good tool for planning our rangeland use as well. Next slide. From this, we've been able to, and this is one of the tools that we're going to develop for every one of our planning regions. Is this is called a conservation networks map, and this gives us an opportunity to look at the big patches that are left and the connections between them. So we can start to actually formulate some goals. So we want to maintain our large patches of native prairie. We want to conserve the connecting corridors. We want to manage the footprint on those remaining patches. We want to reduce the impact of the invasives. And we want to sustain the disconnected. So little bits and pieces of rare things that are left, we want to try to maintain those as well. So now we can start to see, this was one of our lessons, Lynn, at our savory seminar, was looking at the whole, getting in touch with the whole. And so that's what this sort of mapping and planning gives us the opportunity to do. So this can start to drive our actions. Next slide. I'm going to just gloss over this one here. This is just a risk bars, and wildlife managers will look at this. I guess if we look at the sage grouse right now, our wildlife managers would say, we've got to do something because we've fallen into the red zone, very, very high risk to the species. But we can apply this to the amount of land we've got left. We can use it to monitor the population of critters over time. And as they fall from being safe or at moderate risk down into high risk or very high risk, we can start to change our management practices. Next slide. There's a representation of range health on our grazing leases. We have, our ranchers are have done a great job, and this is a great, again, that assistant deputy minister understands that this is biodiversity conservation happening on grazing leases. It's a little more healthy with problems over there in the foothills because there's more traffic, more moisture, and more invasive species. But our public rangelands are predominantly healthy. We've measured them. Next slide. We have a new program that I've been involved in. It's quite exciting. It's called the Land Trust Grants Program. And anytime public land is sold in the province, Fort McMurray is expanding. The dollars from that go to this fund. The dollars are then used to help establish, to support conservation easements around other parts of the province. Now, here's an example here of a conservation easement established in the Crow's Nest corridor, trying to maintain connectivity here across for the elk and other wildlife species to cross Highway 3 corridor. I think in the future, I think this kind of a conservation easement program needs to figure out a way to establish and maintain a flow of benefits over time. I'm not sure that our industry is completely happy with a system that just starts with a lump of money at the beginning and expects perpetual protection, but it's a start. I think we can do better with our conservation easements. Next slide. We have a cool program in southern Alberta called Multisar. And these are a group of biologists and range conservationists that go out and drink a lot of coffee with ranchers, get to know them, build relationships, inventory their property, do an integrated range and wildlife inventory, and then sit down and help those ranchers tweak their grazing. Normally it's just a tweaking process. And so we're over 250,000 acres now, and with probably 35 habitat conservation strategy agreements in place. Next. This is a slide from my colleague James sitting up front here, and this is the Recovery Strategies project that we've been doing with the Foothills Restoration Forum. Again, we go and we look at this in two steps. We look at recent research to find out what's coming out of the universities and colleges in terms of improved practices. Then we go out and talk to the practitioners on the ground, including ranchers, and we find sites where minimum disturbance practices have been tried. And we will go back and look at the outcomes. We'll actually use our range health tools that we're using tomorrow, use our range health tools to actually measure the extent to which recovery has taken place, and then that helps us to sharpen our recovery strategies. Next slide. And there's just an example of natural recovery in the dry mixed grass, which is highly successful. Next. So I'm going to wrap it up here. I just got one more slide to show you after this. This to me is a really good example of the kinds of development practice change that I think can make a difference to the prairie and improve our success at sharing the prairie. This map here, it may not be all that easy for you to see all the detail, but this is a conservation development zones map. And this was developed with some of our land use people in Medicine Hat, working with the oil and gas industry in the Medicine Hat area. And what they did is they sat down and they zoned out the landscape into levels of need. They showed that zone 1 and 2 were the zones that are really needed by the sage-grouse. Zones 3, 4, and 5 can be more tolerant of development. And so they actually started a process whereby, with oil and gas's buy-in, oil and gas started to decommission and reclaim well sites in zone 1 and 2. And as they did that, they started to work out Fish and Wildlife provided them more flexibility to enter into, particularly zones 4 and 5, to carry on with economic development. And up until the time that the EPO hit, I think there were about 17 well sites that were withdrawn from zone 1. So anyway, to me, that's an example of pulling down the footprint and restoring the intact native component of the landscape. So I'll just wrap up with. I just want to an interesting little reminder about the value of what SRM and the PCAP do. I like that statement by Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And this document here was actually submitted by the PCAP, the PCF, at the beginning of the South Saskatchewan regional planning process. And maybe you can't read the headers, but it says, maintain large native parkland and prairie patches, conserve connecting corridors for biodiversity, and protect isolated native habitats. Next slide. And then they sat down and they spent a morning drawing a map. Their map is the map on the left. And maybe it doesn't have all the detail of this more expensive one over here. You can only imagine the dollars that went into this one. But it provides the same essential blueprint for conservation. So anyway, just a tip of the hat and tribute to the work that you folks do. So anyway, that's my message for tonight, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
We have time for a few questions if people would like to ask queries on. Thinking about things. Yes?
Some of us have been a bit concerned about the PFR pastures and what the outcome is going to be, or from your perspective, what's happening?
I'm not at all in touch with the PFA pastures. I'm involved with the Suffield, just the Suffield one in Alberta, and that has resulted in a loss of, PFRA were a very good middleman there between the Army and the ranchers. So it's putting a bigger administrative load on the ranchers to get to know the Army's ways and to be able to work with them. There's 80 members now in the Suffield Grazing Association. Tom Hermans is their leader, and they're off to a pretty good start. So, but from what I've heard, my understanding was that a lot of the PFA pastures are going to end up under Saskatchewan Community Pasture Program. But a lot of that is yet to be determined, right? A lot of this stuff is just in the negotiation stage. That's about all I know. So others here probably have. Carrie, you're an expert on this subject. No? Anybody else? Anybody else know what's happening?
Well, there's a plan to transition the pastures to the province, and then the current board of patrons has the first right to purchase the pastures or to lease them. And I believe the first 10 have transferred more or less, and so far nobody has decided to buy. They've all decided to lease. And even that, you know, it comes with many, many decisions that these groups have to make together and come to an agreement on, and that's kind of been where most of the challenges have been.
And
So,
they would operate as a co-op?
they are operating as a co-op, yes.
They're not
Yeah.
being included in the provincial?
So the land is still a provincial crown land per se, and they're operating it as a co-op and paying rent on that land. Any other questions? Barry's going to be with us tomorrow as well, so if you want to talk him to the side at some point and get into a deeper discussion with him.
I guess I would like, I'm not going to do it, but as you noted in various slides, most of the Canadian leases in Alberta and Saskatchewan are under range health. So essentially it's just a transfer of who's actually operating it. They needn't necessarily be bad and needn't necessarily be good, it's just how they operate. And for the most part, if the people operating it have a large enough share in it, they'll look at it as a needed sustainable resource. Ranching and agriculture is one business where sustainability is a business necessity. If you kill your capital base, you're out of business. So I don't necessarily see anything negative about it. Some of the bigger challenges is because it was once publicly held in PFRA, is there may be more pressures on that land to share it with people that don't understand the sustainability and the necessity of the sustainability process. A whole bunch of people that want to share that resource don't understand. And a good example is Parks Canada. They have a significant staff there to supervise the visitors, to make sure that they don't screw the system up. Private land and PFRA pastures or private leases do not have a publicly paid supervisor there to make sure visitors don't screw the system up. That's a big thing to remember. All your berry pickers, all your hunters, all your whatever you want to come, don't understand, and there's nobody there to supervise it. Just like there's somebody there to supervise you when you visit a national park or a public building in the city. And that's one of the major reasons why private landowners and leaseholders should retain right of access. Because there's nobody there paid to supervise those people that want free access to so-called public land.
Now we have a good example. Just a simple example
of what Lynn is describing in the, if any of you spend any time in the Rocky Mountain Forest Reserve, the lease tenure and the access control in the leases along the Rocky Mountain front ranchers must provide reasonable access. There is a REC access program that, so that there's a reasonable access is provided to the public, but you don't get the kinds of excesses that you see that happen in the forest reserve. And you know, some biologists feel that the way the grizzlies have moved out into the lease land. I mean, grizzlies are all the way across to the McIntyre Ranch now at McGrath. There's some animals reaching that far east. Part of it is just to escape the constant harassment and stress that happens in the forest reserve.
I knew that would happen at some point. Well, again, Barry will be with us also for tomorrow, and the night is still young, so if you have some things you would like to talk to Barry about, feel free to do so. We want to thank Barry very much for coming out and talking to us. We have a little thank you for you. We wanted to mention, we were thinking about a speaker gift, and we figured you probably had an honorable collection of travel mugs and all kinds of other gifts, so we're we're going to make a contribution to the Alicia Hargrave Scholarship in your name. And for those of you who don't know who Alicia Hargrave was, there's a note, a bit of more description about her on your agenda on the back. It was a young lady who was very, very engaged in range management, and she had to leave this earth very much before her time in 2007. And in her honor, there was a scholarship put up through the Society for Range Management Parkland chapter. So we're going to make a contribution to that in your name.
That's one.
Okay. Thank you.